Welcome to True Crime After Dark, where we unravel the darkest corners of the human mind. Charlie Kirk's final day began like many others. He was on the road, speaking at Utah Valley University as part of his American Comeback Tour. The tour was meant to energize students, to bring his message to campuses across the country, and to rally young conservatives in a deeply divided political landscape. But what was meant to be another stop on his tour became the site of a national tragedy. As the event unfolded, the atmosphere was charged with anticipation. Charlie Kirk addressed the crowd, unaware of the danger lurking nearby. The day, meant for inspiration, was about to take a tragic turn. As the crowd gathered, thousands of students, supporters, and local residents, security monitored the entrances and exits. Few suspected that among the noise and excitement, someone was waiting with a rifle. That someone, prosecutors now say, was Tyler James Robinson, 22 years old, a Utah native, with a history the FBI is still piecing together. He arrived that day prepared, carrying a bolt-action rifle fitted with a scope. According to investigators, Robinson positioned himself with a clear line of sight to the stage. At 2:20 p.m., as Kirk spoke, a single shot rang out. Panic erupted in the crowd. Students ducked, screamed, and scattered for cover. Security rushed the stage. Charlie Kirk collapsed. By the time paramedics reached him, the damage was irreversible. The man who had spent his adult life speaking to audiences, stirring debate, and standing at the center of America's cultural divide was gone. In the chaos, investigators began their work. The shooter fled the scene, but he left behind more than witnesses. He left evidence. Casings were recovered, some inscribed with messages investigators now describe as politically charged. Surveillance cameras captured images of a man in clothing marked with a distinctive eagle and flag emblem. The hunt for the killer was underway. Within 48 hours the break came. Robinson allegedly confessed to a family member admitting what he had done. That confession led to his surrender. He was arrested, charged with aggravated murder, obstruction of justice, and weapons violations, and is now being held without bail. For the FBI and federal prosecutors, this was the start of a much larger case. They began combing through Robinson's past, his writings, his associations, and his digital footprint to answer one haunting question: why? To understand the magnitude of what happened on September 10th, investigators knew they had to look deeper into the man accused of pulling the trigger, Tyler James Robinson. At only 22 years old, Robinson was, on the surface, unremarkable. He grew up in Utah, a young man navigating the same struggles, pressures, and uncertainties that many face. But as agents began piecing together his history, a portrait of increasing anger and volatility began to emerge. Neighbors described Robinson as quiet, sometimes withdrawn. He didn't cause trouble, but he didn't make strong connections either. Some remembered him as polite, while others described moments when his temper flared unexpectedly. To those who knew him only casually, nothing seemed extraordinary enough to foreshadow what he would later be accused of. But as investigators dug into his digital life, the story became darker. FBI analysts reviewed his online activity, discovering patterns of engagement with radical communities, angry rants, and writings that revealed a worldview steeped in resentment. His posts suggested frustration not just with political figures, but with entire systems, authority, government, and the cultural divides he believed were swallowing America whole. The FBI has not yet released every detail, but officials confirmed that Robinson had been on their radar in the months leading up to the shooting. His name appeared in connection with online discussions flagged for extremist rhetoric. At the time, there wasn't enough to trigger an arrest or intervention. But after September 10th, those earlier warnings began to take on new weight. What shocked investigators most was the level of preparation. Robinson had not stumbled into the crime on impulse. According to law enforcement sources, he scouted the event, selected a rifle equipped with a scope, and even left behind bullet casings with etched messages, phrases investigators described as politically motivated. One casing bore the words pro-trans, another anti-fascist. These details, authorities believe, were deliberate, meant to send a message. Friends, family, and former classmates were interviewed. Some expressed disbelief, struggling to reconcile the man they remembered with the crime he now stood accused of. Others admitted that Robinson had seemed increasingly troubled in recent months, isolated and agitated, as though something inside him was building toward an inevitable breaking point. For the FBI, this was not just about one man's crime. It was about understanding the pathway that led him there. Each file they collected, each testimony they gathered, painted a picture of a young man drifting further from stability and deeper into grievance. And in the end, that path converged with violence. Robinson now sat in a jail cell, charged with aggravated murder. But the real trial was only beginning. Not just in the courtroom, but in the court of public opinion, where Americans across the political spectrum were grappling with the implications of what had just happened. September 10, 2025 began like any other day at Utah Valley University. Students filled the campus walkways, the fall semester settling into rhythm. That afternoon, the American Comeback Tour was in full swing, and anticipation buzzed across the auditorium as nearly 3,000 people packed inside to hear Charlie Kirk speak. The stage was set with bright lights and a backdrop bearing the name of his tour. Rows of chairs were filled with students, faculty, and locals eager to see the conservative leader. The crowd's mood was electric. Some came out of admiration, others out of curiosity, and a few in protest. But as the hour neared, almost all eyes were on the stage. Charlie Kirk entered with his usual confidence. For years he had thrived in this kind of setting, commanding attention, challenging his audience, sparking debate. He began speaking at around 2 p.m., delivering remarks that were equal parts political and motivational. Laughter, cheers, and applause echoed across the room, but outside the auditorium in the shadows, Tyler James Robinson was preparing. According to the FBI, Robinson had arrived earlier, positioning himself with a bolt-action rifle fitted with a scope. Surveillance footage later showed him wearing clothing marked with a distinctive eagle and flag emblem, details that would help investigators identify him after the chaos. Witnesses recalled seeing a figure moving near the periphery, but in the excitement of the event, no one imagined what was about to happen. At 2:20 p.m., just as Kirk was deep into his speech, a single shot cracked through the air. The sound was unmistakable, a thunderous pop that cut through the applause, silencing the auditorium in an instant. Panic erupted. Students screamed and dropped to the floor. Some bolted for the exit, stumbling over chairs as they tried to escape. Others froze, their eyes locked on the stage. Charlie Kirk fell, collapsing as security rushed forward. The image was seared into the memories of everyone present. A man in the prime of his career, a father, a husband, a leader, struck down in front of thousands. For witnesses, those moments felt endless. The chaos was overwhelming. The cries for help, the scramble for safety, the echo of fear reverberating through the auditorium. Emergency responders rushed in. Paramedics knelt beside Kirk, working frantically to stabilize him, but the wound was catastrophic. Within minutes, it became clear there was nothing more they could do. At 2:38 p.m., the official time of death was recorded. Meanwhile, investigators scoured the scene. Shell casings were found, some etched with politically charged words, inscriptions that spoke not only to the act of violence but to the ideology behind it. These casings would later become crucial evidence, proof of a crime intended as a message. In the immediate aftermath, police and FBI agents launched a manhunt. They reviewed surveillance footage, canvassed the area, and interviewed witnesses who had caught glimpses of the shooter fleeing. The attack was over in seconds. But its impact, on the community, on the nation, and on the political landscape, was just beginning. The shot that ended Charlie Kirk's life reverberated far beyond the auditorium walls of Utah Valley University. In those first chaotic minutes after 2:20 p.m., panic ruled the scene. Students poured out of the exits, some crying, some in shock, others desperately calling their families to say they were safe. Security officers pushed through the chaos, shouting commands, trying to establish order where there was none. Outside the building, sirens wailed as police cars and ambulances converged on campus. Officers formed a perimeter, locking down the university to prevent further violence and to stop the shooter from escaping unnoticed. Parents, alerted by frantic texts from their children, began arriving at the scene, their faces pale with fear. Inside, the aftermath was grim. Paramedics worked over Kirk, but it was too late. The realization spread quickly. The leader of Turning Point USA, a man who had commanded stages across America, was gone. For the witnesses, the shock was unbearable. Some collapsed in tears, while others sat in stunned silence, unable to process what they had just seen. The investigation began immediately. FBI agents, already alerted to the magnitude of the attack, were on the ground within hours. Every inch of the auditorium was examined, photographs were taken, casings collected, witness statements logged. One piece of evidence stood out from the beginning: the bullet casings themselves. Several bore etched messages, politically charged phrases that investigators later described as chilling. Words like pro-trans and anti-fascist were scratched into the brass. This was not a random act of violence, it was meant as a statement. Authorities also pulled surveillance footage from inside and outside the venue. In one clip, a figure could be seen wearing clothing marked with a distinct eagle and flag emblem. Though the image was grainy, it was enough to give investigators a lead. Witnesses confirmed seeing a man matching that description near the edge of the auditorium before the shooting. The manhunt was swift. Officers spread across Orem, Utah, canvassing neighborhoods, showing photos, and asking questions. The FBI tracked phone data, monitored online activity, and reviewed tips pouring in from across the state. But the break came not from digital forensics but from a confession. Within 48 hours, 22-year-old Tyler James Robinson admitted to a family member what he had done. Shocked and horrified, that relative contacted authorities. When Robinson surrendered, he carried with him the weight of his actions. Investigators charged him with aggravated murder, obstruction of justice, and weapons violations. He was placed in custody without bail, his face now known to a nation demanding answers. For the FBI, the arrest was only the beginning. Now they had to piece together the why. What had led a young man from Utah to commit such a brazen act? What had shaped his anger? And what did the writings, the inscriptions, and the digital trail reveal about his state of mind? As Charlie Kirk's family mourned, and as his supporters lit candles and prayed outside vigils across the country, investigators pressed forward. The story was far from over. With Tyler James Robinson in custody, the focus turned from the chaos of the shooting to the question that everyone was asking: who was this young man, and what led him to commit such an act? Robinson was just 22 years old, a name unfamiliar to most until September 10th. Born and raised in Utah, his early life was, at least on the surface, unremarkable. He grew up in the shadow of the Wasatch Mountains, attended local schools, and moved through his teenage years like countless others, quiet, somewhat withdrawn, never the center of attention. But as agents dug deeper, they began piecing together a history that revealed cracks beneath the surface. Neighbors remembered him as polite, if distant. Teachers described him as intelligent, though he often seemed disengaged, living more in his own head than in the classroom. Friends, those few who had been close to him, painted a more troubling picture. They recalled his growing anger, his bitterness toward politics, and his tendency to spiral into rants about systems he believed were broken. The FBI combed through Robinson's digital life, uncovering forums, chats, and social media posts where his discontent spilled out. What they found was a troubling mix of contradictions. On one hand, he aligned himself with causes that challenged authority. On the other, he expressed admiration for violent solutions, praising acts of defiance that crossed into extremism. Agents revealed that his rifle casings had not been marked at random. The inscriptions, words like pro-trans and anti-fascist, suggested a political message, though one difficult to pin down. Was he acting out of allegiance to a movement, or was it a more personal, chaotic expression of anger? Investigators say the answer is still unfolding. Family members, blindsided by his arrest, struggled to explain what happened. Some admitted he had seemed increasingly isolated in recent months. He spent hours alone online, consumed by news, blogs, and discussions that fueled his anger. The FBI is still analyzing his internet history, looking for connections to groups or individuals who may have encouraged his path to violence. One detail that stood out was the deliberation behind the attack. Robinson hadn't acted on impulse. He had scouted the location, selected a weapon designed for precision, and carried out his plan in front of thousands. The inscriptions on the casings, the surveillance footage, the confession to a family member, all of it painted the picture of someone who had made a conscious, chilling choice. For prosecutors, this is more than just a murder case. It is a case of political violence in its rawest form. Robinson has been charged with aggravated murder, obstruction of justice, and weapons violations. If convicted, he faces the harshest penalties under Utah law. But the deeper question remains: was Tyler Robinson an isolated figure, consumed by his own demons? Or was he part of something larger, a symptom of the rising tide of anger and division that has gripped the nation? The FBI continues to sift through evidence, searching for that answer. As the country debates, as vigils for Charlie Kirk spread across campuses and communities, Robinson now sits in a cell, his future sealed by the trial to come. His story is one of a young man whose path twisted into darkness, and whose actions forever altered the lives of thousands who were there that day, and millions who watched in horror as the news broke. As Tyler James Robinson sat in a holding cell, the FBI and local law enforcement worked around the clock to build the case that would define his future. Every detail mattered: the casings found at the scene, the weapon he carried, the surveillance footage, and his own words spoken in the aftermath. Investigators leaned heavily on the confession Robinson allegedly made to a family member, a moment that triggered his surrender. That admission, combined with the physical evidence, gave prosecutors a foundation strong enough to press forward with aggravated murder charges. Yet they knew the trial would demand more than the basics. They needed to show intent, planning, and motive. Forensics teams studied the rifle, confirming that it matched the ballistics of the bullet that killed Charlie Kirk. The casings, etched with politically charged phrases, were examined under microscopes, the etchings photographed and cataloged as evidence. Investigators believed these markings weren't random scratches. They were deliberate, a message left behind by a killer who wanted his act to mean something more than violence alone. Digital analysts combed through Robinson's online history. They unearthed forum posts, comments, and social media activity that suggested a deepening resentment, an anger that seemed to grow unchecked. Prosecutors argue that his digital footprint will play a central role in the trial, illustrating not only his mindset but also his preparation. As the FBI pieced this together, the country watched in disbelief. News outlets ran footage of the chaos inside the auditorium, interviews with shaken students, and images of Robinson being led into custody. The political world reacted with fury and grief. Vigils were held for Charlie Kirk, candles flickering outside Turning Point USA offices, supporters gathering to pray for his family and to denounce the violence that had silenced one of their own. But reactions weren't confined to his supporters alone. Across the political spectrum, leaders condemned the shooting. The refrain was clear: political violence cannot be tolerated, no matter who the target is. Yet, beneath those statements, the nation's divisions grew sharper. Online, debates raged about what the attack meant, who it reflected, and what it revealed about the state of American discourse. For Robinson's defense, the challenges were immense. Represented by court-appointed counsel, his legal team has remained tight-lipped, offering little beyond the standard claims of due process. Whether they will argue mental instability, political motivation, or denial of intent remains to be seen. The trial is expected to be one of the most closely watched in recent memory, with a high-profile victim, a young and seemingly ordinary suspect, and a crime committed in front of thousands. Every detail will be dissected under the public eye. Security around the courthouse is already expected to be heightened, with federal agencies preparing for protests, vigils, and media swarms. For the FBI, the mission is clear: to present a case that leaves no doubt. For the public, the trial promises answers, but also reopening wounds that are still raw. And for the family of Charlie Kirk, it will be a painful march through the details of the worst day of their lives, all in pursuit of justice. As the date of the trial approaches, the question looms large: will the evidence be enough to convict Robinson beyond doubt? And will the verdict bring closure to a nation shaken by yet another act of violence in its political life? The murder of Charlie Kirk did more than take the life of one man. It forced a nation to confront an unsettling reality. Political violence in America is no longer a distant fear. It is happening in real time, at rallies, on campuses, and in public squares. Experts who study extremism point out that acts like this don't come from nowhere. They are the result of growing polarization, the steady drumbeat of hostility, and the echo chambers of online communities where anger festers unchecked. Tyler James Robinson, investigators say, did not invent these grievances on his own. He lived in a digital world that magnified them, gave them sharper edges, and in the end helped push him toward action. The FBI has been blunt in its warnings. Lone actors motivated by political anger or distorted ideologies pose one of the greatest threats to public safety. Robinson, they believe, is a textbook example. A young man isolated, frustrated, and convinced that violence was a way to be heard. For those who knew Charlie Kirk, the tragedy is measured not in theories, but in loss. His wife and children are left without a husband and father. His colleagues at Turning Point USA lost their leader. For his supporters, the loss feels personal, a voice silenced, a presence gone. Vigils across the country have been filled with candles, prayers, and anger that such a thing could happen on American soil. Even those who disagreed with Kirk's politics expressed alarm, because this case isn't just about one ideology or one figure. It's about the belief that violence can be used to settle political arguments. And for many, that belief is the line that, once crossed, puts everyone at risk. As Robinson awaits trial, Americans are left asking themselves what it means for the future. How do you protect free speech when words can make someone a target? How do you safeguard democracy when disagreements turn into bullets? These are the questions echoing beyond Utah Valley University, beyond the courtroom where Robinson will soon stand, and into the heart of a nation still searching for answers. If you believe these important stories must be told, please take a moment to like this video, leave a comment with your thoughts, and subscribe to support more crucial investigations like this one. Your engagement helps us continue shining a light into the darkest corners of the human mind. Together we ensure these truths are never forgotten. No matter where you stand politically, one truth is impossible to deny. There's no room for violence in American politics. The murder of Charlie Kirk was more than an attack on one man. It was an attack on the values of speech, debate, and disagreement without bloodshed. At just 31 years old, Charlie Kirk's life was cut short in front of thousands, silencing a voice that had built a movement and leaving behind a grieving family. His wife, his children, his colleagues, and his supporters now live with a void that can never be filled. His loss is deeply personal for them, and symbolic for the country. Tyler James Robinson, the young man accused of pulling the trigger, will face the full weight of the justice system. But whatever verdict is reached, it cannot undo what happened at 2:20 p.m. on September 10th. It cannot give back a husband, a father, a son. What it can do, however, is remind us all of the cost of hate, of the dangers of division, and of the urgent need to protect both speech and safety. America has seen its share of dark days, but it has always endured. This case will test that endurance again. As we close this story, we honor Charlie Kirk's memory. His voice may be gone, but his impact continues to ripple across the lives he touched. Rest in peace, Charlie Kirk. Thank you for joining us on True Crime After Dark. If you believe these stories must be told, please like this video, leave a comment, and subscribe so we can continue shining a light into the darkest corners of the human mind. And so we never forget the truths that matter most.